I'm Dr. Angie for the Skeptics track, and we have a very interesting collection of folks. Some of them you've seen before. This is all about academics and skepticism. So to my left is Kurt Anderson, who will boggle your mind. Dr. Dana Bevan, who has more experience than I can't, you must come to her talk. It's terrific. And of course, Teddy Fishman at the end is a pracademic. So, Kurt, you have talked a lot about your experience within the academic community and have created your own sort of thing within this whole academic community. Talk a bit about that, please.
Yeah, so for those of you who hadn't heard, and if you've been at the track yet all this year, you've seen me already. I told my wife, I said, man, if you don't care for my voice, you're at the wrong year to come to this track, because I'm each day I'm doing a few things. But brief recap of my life of the last few years. I traveled for about 30 years as a professional magician, cutting people in half, making them float, making cars disappear, and so forth. And I started teaching like twice a semester as a guest speaker in the deception class in the field of communication studies at the University of Alabama, which is 6 miles from my house. And then the pandemic, the professor there said, oh, you know, you would be a great teacher. You should go finish your degree and head towards teaching. I said, well, I'm a magician. That's what I do. It's what I've always wanted to do. Well, the pandemic looked like it was going to be a while, and I don't really like to just sit around, and I can't go anywhere. I'm stuck in my house. And I was like, well, I left college my junior year to pursue my magic career because I had an opportunity to take a 21-show magic tour in Costa Rica and thought this might be my only opportunity to ever travel outside the U.S. You know, I was still in my teens, and so I took that opportunity, and then I never went back, just kept booking shows. And so with the pandemic, I went back. He helped me get a full scholarship, so I finished my undergrad degree. And while I was doing that, I found out that the number one person in the field of communication with a specialization in human deception was the department chair and ran the college at University of Alabama at Birmingham, 45 miles from my house. And I happened to be going to that university for a study for my son who has epilepsy. And so I said, well, I'll just go by and talk to him. So I went by and talked to him, and he said, we would really like to have you in our master's program. And I'm like, well, I don't know if I can travel back and forth, and I'm a magician. And he's like, full scholarship. We'll pay you to teach. We'll give you an additional scholarship and a stipend to cover your expenses. And I was talking to my wife, and she goes, you know, no disrespect, but the young sexy's over. You're not going to get your own Vegas show. You're not going to be on TV a lot. At some point, it makes sense to pivot out, right? And I'm like, well, that's true. And she said, you can still do shows. And I said, well, what about Ty? Because, you know, my special needs son. And so I talked to him. He said he can come to all the classes that you teach and that you take. If you have a show, you can go. So, like yesterday, all other professors and teachers in the department they had class on Friday, and I was at DragonCon. And so they said, as long as your students don't get behind and you teach the same curriculum and you make a plan, no problem. So I am presently getting my master's degree in human deception, and I'm bringing something to the table that there's never been in the field. In the academic field, it's all based on research and studies and this, gathering data and doing the scientific method. But they've never had anybody that had 30 years experience of deceiving people in the field. So I have something that I can bring to the table that they just can't, they don't know what to do with, right? But magicians, on the other hand, don't have the academic knowledge of how deception is built. We just kind of try something. If it fools people, we do it again. So I'm trying to become this bridge between the two, where I can take the principles by which we deceive people and try to help categorize and quantify that so that we can study it and better understand how deception works, so we can protect ourselves as humans from people trying to deceive us, and then eventually take that information when we refine it and find the basis for this and take it back to magicians and go, look, instead of just trying a bunch of stuff, understand how this is built and how these things work, and then you can be better magicians. And then I've already been offered a spot on 3 different college programs to do my PhD. Also paid position, my son can come to classes and so forth. So I have, next semester I'll graduate with a master's degree and probably start my PhD in the fall next year somewhere.
So, I know, right? Yay. Dr. Bevan?
Okay. Well, I started out in academia and as a graduate student, and I wasn't very happy in that environment. So I took up my option to go into the military and did research for the military, and eventually got out. Was a Cold War warrior for years, developing new technologies and adapting old technologies to soldiers. And along the way, I got into the remote sensing field, which means taking pictures from air and space of the battlefield, and you've seen a lot of those recently. One of my specialties was what they call denial and deception, which is how do you defeat those sensors? And because I was working with photo interpreters, and so the question was, what do you do to make the picture so that they can't understand what's really there?
So you and Kurt need to talk.
So I was in the deception business for a while, and I met one of my customers was a major in the Air Force, and so he went off and did his thing, and I got a job at Georgia Tech for as a professor, and later on he came back to me and said, well, I want you to start my R&D department. And I said, well, okay, from scratch. And by then I didn't realize it, but he'd retired as a major general. And so he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So I got back out of academia into the free market of research, which I've always enjoyed more. And then it came a time when I had to figure out what I wanted to do about, I'm transgender.
No. No, I've seen your talk several times.
Well, I know. I had to figure out what to do about that, and so I'm a scientist, I'm a psychologist, so I delved into everything I could find that was scientific, that provided evidence for why people were transgender and all the nuts and bolts of that. And so now I've published 4 books on the subject, and I help out several organizations dealing with transgender kids and so forth. So that's what I've been doing. In the process of dealing with transgender kids and other transgender people, I deal with academics. And I'll save for my opinion about that till you tell me to talk about it. But in general...
talk about it.
Okay.
Please.
In general, I'm mystified. I deal with a lot of MDs and PhDs in academia who are doing research, and they seem to have quite a schizophrenic attitude towards rationality and realism and science. On one hand, they practice, at least I hope they do, they practice according to evidence and scientific method, but a lot of them I see them dealing with emotional things and not rational things. So I see a lot of irrationality, and I hope it's not spreading back into the medical field.
Yeah,
so
sadly, yeah.
Yes, so I see a lot of that, and it's concerning to me. So that's why I keep on going, trying to push what's real and what's scientific evidence that tells us what to do.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. We are seeing it, and I'm a medical doctor, and I know Stephen Novella has had a big problem at Yale, where there are insidious sort of finger infiltration of non-evidence-based practices, which are I consider harmful, even if they're not physically harmful. I think that it wastes resources, it wastes the patient's time and energies when we really need to be concentrating on what we know has good evidence for function over and above the placebo effect. And I was at a hospital system up in another city that was, I mean, a reputable one that was beginning to allow chiropractors access to inpatients, and I was furious about that, but I couldn't do anything about it because they're not interested. This particular facility was a non-academic institution, but I know I have seen this in academic institutions, including my medical school. They had some infiltration at that point. I think it's important to know about it because patients will use it, and you need to have information on how to talk to them. Have you found anything, Teddy, in your academic
oh gosh,
corollaries?
Yeah, absolutely. I came to the work that I do now after I had been an academic in an English department, and then I left it to go do work for the International Center for Academic Integrity. I was the director there for almost a decade, and that's what I do now is I work with academic integrity issues around the world, mostly with the European Network on Academic Integrity now. And 100%, like it is, I share your dismay at the idea that in one area of our lives, we have dedicated ourselves and committed ourselves to saying we're going to look at evidence-based information. We are going to see things that we can prove and things that we can replicate, and studies that have measurable effects, and the measurability is predictable and consistent. And then in other areas, we just go, oh, but on the other hand, this also kind of feels good, so I'm going to do that thing. And it is a huge problem. I was getting a little worried when you started about what academics are like, because I am very firmly rooted in that world. But even as, you know, just a regular person during the pandemic and listening to the voices of doctors and nurses talking about things that were absolutely unproven, like absolutely unproven remedies, absolutely unproven allegations, you know, putting those things head to head as if they had equal standing as, you know, replicated studies that had shown one thing, but on the other hand, you know, this one case happened and we really don't like that this happened, and you know, if we talk about that, enough people will be scared of it. So it is absolutely the case that a person can be rational in one area of their life and just absolutely blind to their prejudices and their irrationality in another area. 100%.
And it's hard, you know, because the individual may have the knowledge and may have the data to not promote those ideas. You all right over there?
Yeah.
Okay.
My chair was stuck.
Oh. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So but then they're faced against this institutional you can't get chiropractors not to have. Sorry, I'll point towards the mic, Mark. But you can't get the institution to rescind the privileges when you got chiropractors now have ability to go see inpatients or music therapists, or, you know, I mean, I think it sounds lovely. It's wonderful. We had a guitarist in the emergency department one day, and that was lovely. But I would rather have had nurses or, you know, masks or some, you know, other things that we needed immediately to take care of the patients. But my point is, it's difficult to extract that once they've gotten a foothold.
Well, and especially in a consumerist-based system, right? Mm-hmm. So if the patients are saying, you know, I really like chiropractors, and the hospital says we can make X amount of dollars per year if we have chiropractors, mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that concern overrides the fact that there's no, you know, there's no evidence that says that what they're
there.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I did not mean to hijack this into medical. I mean, I sort of did, but I didn't mean to. What have you noticed any particular struggles in getting evidence-based education or critical thinking involved?
What I've noticed is that you know, there's a field called epistemology, which
Sure.
is how do you know something, and what I see is gravitation towards what's called standpoint epistemology. That is, I'm the only one who can know because of my characteristics or my background, you know, what's the correct, in your case, medical things. rather than a general epistemology where there's a competition of ideas and discussion and hopefully some resolution as to what the truth is, or at least what's real. So I see a lot of standpoint epistemology being exercised or conversely, people are asked questions and they say, well, I can't answer that because I'm not a transgender person or whatever. And I'm saying, well, hell, you're supposed to know these things, right? You're supposed to be expert in this. Why don't you know? And they say, well, I don't know because I don't have that experience. So I see a lot of that going on.
Yeah, the medical equivalent is when you try to disavow someone of their belief in a particular remedy or whatever, they say, it works for me.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't. I wish it did. I really did. I wish I had additional stuff, but it doesn't. So, have you seen any resistance to your...
So, my particular field of studies is different, and people find it fascinating. And then with my background, I don't get as much resistance. But things that I've noticed in the field is what's that?
You'll make them disappear.
Yeah, right. What I've noticed in the field is some of the problem is the way that we communicate. Of course, my specialty is communication, and some of the ways that we communicate cause some of the issues. And even professional communicators, people within the field of College of Human Communication, don't communicate ideas well. So I'm sure each of you can verify that there's things in your particular field of study at the highest level, there's more than one definition for a particular term.
Oh, yeah.
So what happens is we talk to 3 different professionals, and we don't like 2 of them's opinion, and the third one says, well, their definition that they're working with is this. And they go, well, see, they can't even agree, so I don't have to listen to them. And we don't do a good job of explaining that. And it's not that any one of the 3 definitions are wrong. It's that as you're studying very specific areas of, say, nonverbal communication, a working definition for one model works better in certain areas than a different definition. So 3 definitions can all be correct, but all serve a different purpose. And there's some things that we just can't easily define anyway. Right, so if I'm talking about nonverbals, could be completely different when I'm talking about what I use on stage, as opposed to nonverbals when I'm talking about how my son communicates because he can't talk anymore due to a very strong aphasia. And so at like the general vernacular, we think of just nonverbal and it kind of all fits. But at the highest level, those things can have different definitions. And so when experts are talking, and you don't like what they're saying, and you can find something that you definitely, well, this guy said it's this guy said it's this, so obviously they don't even know, so I don't have to listen to them. So we've created an environment where it's easy to dismiss anything that we don't agree with, and some of these concepts, Angie can't put a 20-year study and practice and everything she's learned into a 30-second soundbite and have you understand what she's been throughout all of the patients she's seen and everything she's learned. But that's what everybody wants. They want this in 30 seconds, describe what everything is transgender. You can't do that, right? So you give the highlights, and then they go find somebody that has a different highlight, and they go, well, they're just pushing their own agenda. I don't have to believe them because that doesn't even match up with this other person on transgender. And so part of the problem I think that's caused this is we haven't found a way to communicate properly these complex ideas in an environment where people would rather watch people kick each other in the nuts and read a meme, right?
Hashtag job security.
Yeah, right. That's good for you, but not the rest of us. So that's part of it. And then another part is at the highest level, you do get some people who just feel like they know enough now that they can't be wrong. Mm-hmm. And then that's what opens them up to, well, this feels right. So rather than all this scientific things I've got to get here, now I'm going to kind of go on what I feel because I can't be wrong. I'm the expert.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that Dunning-Kruger effect, Don Prothero talked about yesterday.
Yeah.
And I heard it from you.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly, the more someone doesn't understand, the more they're likely to think they understand. Mm-hmm. And that is responsible for so much of the misinformation that we have right now. And right now, I mean, it used to be the case that in order to find expertise, you had to go to libraries, you had to go to studies, you had to go to experts, and now there is so much information available online that people have the false idea that they understand a subject in ways that they really couldn't without years of study and understanding the practices of whatever discipline it is and understanding some of the history, like all those things. And they say, well, I did my own research. And you say, well, what research was that? Well, you know, I looked at these 3 Twitter...
I sat on the toilet for
Yeah.
4 minutes with Google.
Yeah.
Well, and that word is one of those things I was talking about.
Yeah.
Because when you're at work, reading articles about something's not research, right?
Right.
You're doing a lit review.
Yeah.
People do lit reviews, which means they've read certain pieces of literature about something. Research is when you're putting together a study and you're gathering data. So, you know, this is a simple thing that it gets miscommunicated, because when someone says I've done my research, they literally have done no research. None. Not at all. Now, they may have done a lit
review. And probably don't understand how to do the research.
Right.
Like,
They don't even, and so I was in an argument with a guy about this QAnon thing, and he goes, well, I've done my research. I said, okay, tell me what your protocol is and what your method of research is. And he's like, well, my wife is in a research lab, so I know. I'm like, yeah, that's not an answer.
Right.
You know, how have you verified your sources? What's your method? Explain this to me. And he just got furious, and then he eventually just cut the conversation off. And you think, as easy and simple as a word as research is, that if somebody asked you, you would be able to define it. But it can be a difficult thing to define, and he really had done zero research and wasn't even sure what research was, but touting this, well, I've done my research. So I think that's a key word. That's a good point towards what I was saying, is even simple words like research mean vastly different things to different people. And we need to communicate that better as academics, I think.
That was great. I absolutely agree. So we do have a mic here in the aisle. If anyone does have any questions, we'll start peppering in with that. Have we lost all ability to appreciate nuance, or do we just end up getting pedantic?
Well, I would say part of it goes back to what you were speaking about the fact that we don't communicate well how these things happen. I was just at a research conference earlier this year. It was in Portugal, and I was the 3rd keynoter of 3. And the first 2 keynoters, I
want to speak in Portugal. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was the 3rd keynoter of 3, and the first 2. When I close out a conference, I always try to pay attention about what has happened and kind of work it in. And what struck me and just hit me in the face about the first 2 is they had to say and reiterate that in spite of what they were showing about how some misinformation had happened, it was an academic integrity conference, so they were talking about how data can be misleading and some of the information that's out on the internet is not reliable. They both felt it necessary to say at an academic integrity conference that we should still trust science. And I thought, has it really gotten to that point where just pointing out that some information is wrong has to be caveated by somebody else, by the person saying, despite some information being wrong, we still have to trust science. And so part of my talk ended up being about the fact that we need to do a better job. This is why I said it came back to what you said. We need to do a better job of helping the public to understand how knowledge in academia is generated and how it's vetted. Because as far as a lot of people are concerned who have never had any experience in academia, what we're doing is just like what they're doing. Like, they don't understand how we are actually designing a study, how we are having, our study design looked at by peers and, having errors, potential errors pointed out, and then how we actually do the study, publish the study, again, have that critiqued by other people who are welcome to show us where our mistakes are and how something else would be a more valid measurement. Like, all those things are happening, but they're not happening in a way where the public can understand it. And so when the experts, who have done this valid research come and say, here are our findings, to somebody who doesn't understand how that knowledge was generated and vetted, it doesn't look any more reliable than, this other stuff that, just comes to us randomly.
Right. Well, even before that, the thing I keep running into is people don't understand scientific ethics in terms of research, and that there are laws, federal laws, that require certain things. people will say, well, we've got a treatment for trans kids, we'll just not give it to some kids and give it to others. And you can't do that. That violates federal laws about ethics, because you have some reason to believe that the treatment will be beneficial. In some cases, like in drug studies, they get a little bit down the road and they find out that the drug does work, and now they have to give it to everybody.
Yeah.
But people misunderstand that you can't just willy-nilly form control groups for human patients, human beings. You may be able to do that for rats, but you just can't do that. So I'm constantly getting these things, well, that, this treatment for trans kids hasn't been proven because there's not a double-blind study that shows that it's beneficial. Well, you can't do that study. It's illegal to do that study in the U.S. So people don't understand that there's a long history of ethical principles that have come, and we've made mistakes over the years.
That's how we
There's
get the ethical
really
principles.
good reasons for those.
There are really good reasons for those, and psychologists have done their part.
Yeah.
So in a negative way. So that's always a problem. The other is definitional. Of course, the thing I keep running into is definitions of sex and gender, and there are shysters out there now, that Matt Walsh in particular, who's publishing movies, documentaries of making using the conflation of sex and gender to what is a woman. Well, without getting into the details, he's not following the scientific definitions of either sex or gender. But it's easy to get mixed up because the press doesn't. Press thinks that gender is a polite word for sex, and it's not from a scientific point of view.
Yeah, and those words get used wrong so often. You see it, like, even in job applications, when they put sex, and some will, like, I saw one where it said, like, what is your sex, male, female, or other? And when, like, gender, they're asking gender and they're writing sex.
Yeah.
And so if everyday use these interchangeable, then people think they're interchangeable. So it undermines the whole thing.
Well, and it's so much easier to explain something in simple terms that are wrong than to explain things in their full complexity. And that argument seems to be persuasive with people who like to put things into discrete categories, even when those categories do not adequately encompass the complexity of what you're talking about, right? There's something in us that likes things to fit neatly into boxes. Some things don't fit neatly into boxes.
Okay. Yep, we have a question at the mic.
Yeah, you've actually started to drift into the question I was going to ask. I was having a conversation just recently, and someone asked me when we were debating, well, do you believe in science? And I tried to explain, well, no, because science is a tool. I don't believe in hammers either. And you've gone into some of this about how do we establish a common language for people that disagree on a particular issue, even diametrically opposed. We still need to have a common language so that we can have the conversation and reach some kind of compromise or agreement or path forward. So how do we build a language where we can have these conversations, even at a fundamental foundational level?
Wait, before you, I'm sorry, I'm looking at your mask. Those are my initials. And so his
It's
mask
about
says,
you.
I heart AM. And I'm like,
have a fan
thank
club.
you.
I need to be here.
I'm sorry, please. I didn't mean to do that. Go ahead, y'all.
Well, it's such a great question because you demonstrated the problem in the language that, of the debate that you had with your friend, that idea of belief,
He wasn't
like,
my friend.
just being gentle. Like when someone says something that I think is just a ridiculous sentence, like, I don't believe in homosexuality. I'm like, they don't care. Like, that doesn't have any effect on what is actually true in the world. But that word belief means something different, to the person using it like that.
True, that's true.
Yeah, I mean,
Agree.
it was a brilliant illustration of the problem that we're talking about. And the first thing that we have to do then is to define our terms. Like, when you say that, do you mean you don't approve? Do you mean you don't think it's real? What is the thing that you mean when you say that? And then, perhaps we could have a discussion, often with a statement like that, that's a sign to me that we're probably not going to have, I'll try a little, but if somebody starts with that, then I'm just like, yeah, they don't care, and I have to go somewhere.
Yeah, getting the definitions up front and then finding out what they mean by their specific words. Because a lot of times, again, we can be using research, and what you mean is, you're reading people's Facebook posts, and what I mean is I'm going through and finding where they did studies and looking at the actual research. And so, and they gave you a definition that is to be wrong, or you want to use a different definition you think is more accurate, ask them how they came across that definition and why that particular one. Oftentimes people say, well, there's only one definition for a word. I'm like, really? Because run has over 400 definitions and it's a fairly common word. So when you run to the store, or you run the 50-yard dash, or your faucet's running, those are 3 different things, same word. So the definitions are important. And if you start there, sometimes it will kind of open things up. Some people, I think you're just not going to reach, but if you can at least get them to start agreeing on finding better definitions, that may be a starting place.
Yeah. I mean, in medicine, we see it all the time, because medical terms often have very, very specific meanings. So when I'm talking to a patient, I'll say, tell me about your pain. And they'll say, oh, it's acute. I'm like, okay, do you mean that it hurts a lot? Do you mean that it has lasted less than 3 months, which is the definition? Or, did it came on suddenly? They don't know what it means. And then, so you have to make sure you nail it down. And I sound very pedantic when I'm asking them, but it's important for me to understand what they mean, because they've been watching Grey's Anatomy or whatever, is on, and they think they know the usage of the word, and they don't necessarily. So
See, if they'd watched House, they'd have had it figured out already.
they would have known everything by then, except they
It's
just
not
throw up
lupus.
blood on the camera, and now you've got my attention. So, so thank you very much for that's what they always did. I hate that show. Anyway, no, I don't hate the show. I only saw it once or twice, but yes.
I wanted to build on what the last person said when he said, believing in science or believing in hammers. I want to pass along something from a previous DragonCon speaker who said, she said, rather surprisingly, she said, I don't believe in evolution. And she said, I also don't believe in the germ theory of matter. She said, I accept evolution and I accept the germ theory of matter. And that changes the whole, then it doesn't become a belief.
Yes.
It's you either accept this or you reject it. But I wanted to ask, follow up on what Dana was saying. So there are such things as double-blind tests on humans, like, someone gets the drug and someone gets the placebo, but you're saying there's cases where you can't ethically do that. So I'm asking, where is the dividing line between a double-blind drug test and you can't ethically do a double-blind treatment of a trans child?
Oh, or anything else. There's a principle in medicine, that medical research, that you have to have, when you're testing things, they have to be maybe equal or slightly better. Like I have vaccine A and vaccine B, and you think that but you can't test things where something works, but you're going to deny it to.
Okay, so the
patient.
dividing line is it's been confirmed to work, whereas with the double-blind drug test, where it's brand new, we don't know if it works yet.
Well, it's not even it's confirmed. Is that do you have good reason, or that there's previous research, but there's some hardcore people. There's Cochrane. There's this over in Britain. They published this medical Cochrane things, and they won't accept data that hasn't been, or won't accept results that haven't been in double-blind studies, which is absurd because there are a lot of times when you can't do those.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and like you said, if you find out then that there's a big benefit, that you are ethically required to go and offer that to the people that didn't get that treatment, which I think
Right.
a lot of people are just completely unaware of. That,
Yeah.
Right.
that then once you find it out, you're not done.
You also are required to stop a study that is obviously showing harm.
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
exactly.
So, yes, ma'am, next question.
So first of all, I wanted to go back to Kurt's use of the word research, and I think that commonly, I think what people are thinking about when they say, oh, I've done my own research, is the way that we did it in high school, which is, oh, well, I read some articles and I kind of thought about them a little bit, so I've done research. I'm ready to write a paper, basically, is kind of, I think, what they're saying. The other thing is that I think we've seen the rise of this notion of both-siderism, where we feel like, particularly the press, I think, is really bad about this, is that we have to present both sides of an issue, even if there's really not another side of it. And I was wondering if you guys have encountered this in the academic context, where you feel like there is leeway being given to the presentation of not so solidly based ideas, simply for the appearance of having considered both sides.
Well, like when you were saying leeway, I would say, and caveat here, K through 12 education is not my area. Like, I just read about it a little bit, but there are parents' bills of rights that are advancing through state legislatures right now that give parents the right to object to a particular perspective being given, and their definition of perspective might include things like evolution or germ science or history, that actually happened. And that is a huge leap backward in terms of the integrity of our K through 12 education, right? Because if just because a parent thinks that side isn't correct, I mean, I have run into students myself who did not want to study the theory of evolution, and a professor had to tell them, you don't have to believe this, but you do have to understand, in order to be an educated person, how it works. Right? And then you can, if you choose to reject it, there's nothing we can do about this, but you can't be certified as having passed our biology program without understanding how this thing works. And that is what I've seen at the college level. But now at the high school and K through 12 level, we are in danger of parents being able to say, because I don't think, or I don't agree with the theory of evolution, I won't have my child learn it, or I insist on having an alternative theory taught to my child because I have the control of his or her education.
At the college level, I still get that request from parents.
Oh, yeah. I'm not saying they don't request it.
Right,
so far,
right,
I've seen
right.
it resisted
no,
at college.
I'm just saying, I'm confirming,
Yeah.
what you're saying, and it's, my policy is I don't deal with parents. Like, you're not in class. If you paid
Right.
for them, great. It's still not your class, right? You're not
Right.
registered. You're not here. And I've had to tell students, like we talk about in communication. In my class, we actually talk about sex and gender and things, and they were like, well, that's got nothing to do with communication. I said, it absolutely does. Until you know who you are, until you know other people and their perspective, you can't communicate properly with them. And in this class, everyone's given equal voice, equal respect. But I'm asked by the department to say, you do not have to believe this, but you will be tested, and your answers on the test must be as it's taught in the class and in the book. So it's kind of sad when you can take something that all the science and all the research and all the evidence in general points to something, and we can show that, but then we even have to say, now you don't have to believe it, but you do have to test on it.
Right.
You can lead them to it, but you can't make them think.
Right.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
And I wasn't trying to say, by the way, that using research in a general sense, as the American public or other people do, is wrong. We don't make the distinction between the two definitions as clear as we should, as I just proved.
Well,
Right.
and what Dr. Angie said, like, that's so true that, like, like, the way that I talk about things that are medical and the way that you would talk about things that are medical are not the same. I'm an English major. You know what I mean? I would not
I
know.
was an English major. Oh my gosh. I need to.
I didn't know that
need to have a
definition of
Shakespeare
acute about less than 3 months. Like, until you just said it, I had no idea. But that's why you turn to an expert, because the expert is the person who does know what that means.
Yeah, that's the goal. But it does get bastardized into common speech. Like, nobody just has a headache anymore. They all have migraines.
Yes.
And that's not true. There are very specific kinds of headaches that are termed migraine. And when you say migraine, you may mean the classic with the aura, and it's localized to the right temple or to one of the temples, and you have this weird visual stuff, and it lasts blah, 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 and all that stuff, where they just mean, I have a really bad headache. And so, because there are lots of those, but migraine just sounds worse. And
That's
some people
because you
just
can
wanna
buy
be worse.
Tylenol and Tylenol migraine. So it must be everybody's got it, right?
Maybe. Shock. Everybody's in shock. Well, did you drop your blood pressure? Or is your heart rate going fast?
Right.
Are you exsanguinating?
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Yes.
Okay, can you hear me with the mask on?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So yeah, I'm going to try to get to a clear question. I'm thinking through this. But so I came to this panel kind of wondering what your take was going to be, whether you were going to put like skeptics as a community kind of antagonizing academia. I'm an academic. I'm not, I mean, I know what the skeptical community is. I'm not really a part of it, but I'm curious. But what strikes me that's happening now is that there's kind of like an antagonism against academia as just authority and expertise, just like there is with medical establishment. Like, well, we can't trust the vaccines because it's big pharma, or we can't trust universities because they've got the trans agenda, or whatever, the discourse is. And so what do you do about that discourse of skepticism itself being turned against expertise in a kind of like populist way, like I did my own research, or like Alex Jones saying, like, I'm the little guy against the big guys using my research, right? So how does skeptics as a group deal with that attack on expertise as a...
Welcome to the Skeptic Track.
Yeah.
And that's an excellent question. That's what we're
Yeah, and
trying
I'm
to
not
figure
sure
out.
as a group we do that. We as little groups we do that, right? Because different areas of the skeptic community do it different ways, and maybe that's necessary, and maybe we should be more unified. Like, we haven't got the answers to that, I don't think, yet. But yeah, it's a great question, right? How do we do this? Well, right now, not real efficiently, right? There's a lot of voice on the other side. What about in the different areas? Because I really think this is great when you've got completely different areas of academia. Do you each approach it differently on the panel?
Well, I think, as someone said earlier, skeptical and critical thinking is a tool, and you can misuse that tool. You can use it for purposes that are unethical, so using skeptical and critical thinking skills are not without ethics. You have to be responsible about it. I mean, in some cases in academia, they're not responsible about using skeptical approaches, and they tear down things like the Enlightenment, they tear down things like science, they tear down things like democracy, because they want to do that. That's part of their philosophy, and that is not a proper use of skepticism.
There are a few things that spring to mind as things that either have worked in the past or should work that are working less now. And one of them, to my great sadness, is transparency. Like, it used to be the case that when someone was skeptical of a scientific study, for instance, you could publish the details, and it would be more likely that people would go, oh, I looked through this and I understand now how they came to those conclusions. And now it seems to be more more likely than it has been in the past for people to look at those details and try to like find any tiny little thing that you could attack and say, well, it's not right because of this, and it's not right. And the internet is absolutely full of those things where, you know, a highly credible study that's been replicated will be torn apart because of some little flaw in the research design. And those of us who, you know, have done research or who read research, we know that there are lots of little tiny flaws that make the study not perfect, but still, you know, a reasonable thing to, you know, proceed on the basis of, right? So it is worrying for us. I'm speaking for the whole community.
Right.
I'm not really.
Conversely, there are skeptical arguments that aren't published because journals won't publish them, and so there's not a free speech
right.
going on.
And it used to be. I used to think, and I used to argue for, and I still argue for sometimes, that we should also publish our failed research because it is so useful to see what has been tried and not worked, right? And like really, we should have a journal of failed research where everybody, before you do a study, you can look, oh, look, they tried this and this is how it failed. So you could do something slightly different, right? But the problem right now is that we are so polarized and we're so tribalized, and you know, interesting left, there's good research to suggest why this is, you know, that evolutionarily probably belonging to a group was so important that being wrong was less threatening to us than, you know, being cast out. It makes sense that people would react in tribal ways unless they have the tools and the confidence to actually say, you know, oh, you know, I understand we've always done things this way, but it turns out that was a mistake. Maybe we should do something different, right? So I don't have an answer to your question. I've only offered ways that it is a very complicated question at this particular moment, especially because if we would make things more transparent, the likelihood is they would be attacked even more.
And so to answer in kind of a different version of how I understood the question is like if someone specific or a group is attacking a scientific idea or method, how do we deal with that? And to me, I try to explain that, you know, science, like anything else that's a human endeavor, is never 100% correct, right? And I mentioned this in a panel yesterday. You say, well, what's a fact, right? A fact is something that we've tested and observed and we know, and it's replicated and we know it. But an interesting thing that will blow people's mind is not all facts are true. Okay, so at one point, we would watch the sun and it would come up, and it would go over and it would set, and we could watch this every day. We recorded every day. And so, you know, they didn't know Occam's razor, but the simplest explanation is the sun revolves around the earth, and that was a fact. Wasn't true, it was a fact, till we got better information. So when somebody says, oh, well, I don't have to believe this because of this small mistake like she's talking about. Yes, there are small mistakes, but we're improving our understanding all the time. We're never 100% correct. We're always working with our best wrong answer. So to throw something out and discredit it because of something small is pretty silly. It's just like your grandmother may be a great cook, but if she messes up her chili one time, you can't say, well, I'm never eating her chili's terrible because of, you know, one batch. And so there are people who go out there and they publish studies trying to get results that they want, and you can set up an experiment to get results that you want in certain ways, and you can, you know, statistics aren't always as meaningful as they should be, but try to encourage people to look at the metadata and the long term, like when this has been replicated once or twice, if it's been replicated 100 times, and now you're saying because of one mistake in one study, you're going to throw out these other 100, they start to understand how big. I was going over climate change with somebody, and it's like, well, this article says this one says this. I said, yes, but if you go to this book where they have 2,000 studies over 80 different scientists in 14 different countries, and they don't all match, but 98% of what they're saying matches, now that's harder to discount. Now, will some people still discount it and disrespect it? Sure. But if you look at the metadata, which we, I think as an academic community don't point to enough. We like to point to a study because people want to read this short blurb. Okay, that's fine. Here's a study. Here's 1,000 studies, right? Are you going to discount all 1,000 studies because one mistake in study number 49? And so it becomes a perspective thing to me, and that it works sometimes it doesn't, but I like to try that.
Yeah, and one of the problems is that a lot of journals won't publish studies that have negative results. So your literature is going to be skewed,
Yes.
towards positive results in the first place, and they don't usually publish replicated positive studies.
Right.
So again, further skewing the literature. So the literature is not perfect.
Right.
You just do the best you can and hope that eventually you'll get closer and closer to what's true. I mean, science just sort of lurches its way, or at least the fund of knowledge lurches its way towards what's real.
Because it's self-correcting, right? Because we keep
That's
studying
the goal.
it.
That's the
Yes.
goal. So, anyway, we've got about 10 minutes left. Yes, sir.
All right, so I'm actually an engineer. I had a very short stint as an academic, but that was a long time ago. And I came to the mic because of what Kurt was saying about communication and generally the subject of communicating precisely and using common definitions is very kind of close to my heart, okay? I had this silly discussion one time at work when my coworker said something and I corrected the term that he was using and he said, oh, that's just semantics. And I said, well, yeah, okay, semantics is from Greek semantikos, means meaning, so if you discard
Words
semantics,
mean
you
things.
discard the meaning, right? So how are you supposed to communicate? And but there is one thing that kind of troubles me when I'm observing is that a certain erosion or maybe a drift in definitions. So over time, terms tend to change the meaning. And not necessarily only in academia, in everyday life. And I think that one of the factors of this, there is a huge influence of industry. So the example from my area would be artificial intelligence. So this term is horribly overused today, and every company wants to say, I do AI. Well, my thesis when I was back in college, okay, was speech recognition. Well, by that definition, I did AI back then. I didn't realize I did it. To me, that's not AI, that's just a simple algorithm. Okay, so, but it's just an example.
Yeah.
The point is, how do you protect the academia or how do you protect the definitions that are valid from erosion? Right? And the other thing is that when we define something, we also use words, right? Those words need to be defined. So in math, you start with axioms. You don't have axioms in language, right? So how, somebody here said, I accept it, but I don't believe it. Well, then define what is belief, what is acceptance, and so on and so on. You can go on like this forever. So where do you stop?
So it's really difficult because words are arbitrarily assigned. They only have meaning because we give them meaning. So if we change our understanding of something, it changes the meaning of the word. That's the meaning of that word. And that's why I said it's so important when we're using words with somebody to give them our definition. So I think the only way you can really kind of protect, like if you have specific words that have integrity to you, is to tell people when I say this is what I mean, and give them that definition. Because sometimes what happens is I use a word and I think you know what I'm talking about, and you have a general sense, but it, like you said, it kind of gets diluted maybe. And so then if you hear somebody say something and you're repeating what they said and somebody goes, I don't know what that word is, and but you can't really give them the definition, so they think when you tell them a definition that's a definition, so that becomes their understanding. So I think the only way you can really deal with that is when you're talking about these specific words or terms or ideas, say this is my definition that I'm using for this, and realize that they may have a different one, but even if you disagree, this is the definition for this as I'm using it here.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I would say that like the history of language shows us that we can't protect a definition of a word. What we can do is what you're suggesting, that we can say how we're using it in this particular context, but language grows and changes and evolves, and it moves from place to place and has a slightly different meaning when it gets over here than it meant over there because the context is different. Like I don't think it's possible to protect a meaning of a word, but what it is possible to do is to explain how this word is functioning in this particular context.
Right.
We can't even-
Literally has a definition now that it means it's not literal, right?
That one bugs me. Most of them don't. Like I'm
Right.
used to the evolution of language, but making something mean the opposite of what it actually means.
Yeah,
That one
and
bothers
another
me.
complexity is there are words in some languages that there's nothing comparable in another. So when we're
Yes.
trying to give a definition, that gets really, cumbersome.
And even more confusing from my perspective is a word that is the same word in two different languages and means different things. So when you have an international audience, you have to be really careful about making sure I'm talking about this in this way, not in this other way.
Right.
Yeah.
And they're also context dependent. So Dr. Bevan and I are both doctors, but who do you want to see in the exam room?
And if you see me in the exam room, something's gone terribly wrong.
Well, I think there scientifically there has to be some discipline about terms and recognition about this problem. And in engineering and physics and other things, there are recognized terms, but scientists have to defend them. Otherwise, they'll get watered down or misinterpreted. And I don't see them doing that very well lately.
Yeah, that was kind of my point a little bit, that we need to defend the terms. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Well,
Yeah.
do you think that that's a function of the extensive knowledge base, making it more difficult to define the terms in a way that a non-expert would understand?
I think it's a product of the business of science that people, want their research to be popular enough that they get the next research grant. So I think that they go with the flow, or in the case of universities, they have PR departments that write these horrendous press releases about research results. And I swear I never follow those. I always go to the actual research paper. But there's some fuzziness there because of the way academia communicates its work, its results.
All right. A couple more minutes. Yes.
Yes, we were talking about communication across language barriers, and it perfectly leads into my question because I teach English as a second language. And so I'm interacting with dozens of different cultures on a daily basis. I have, 20-something different countries represented in each class I teach. And my question was if you had any suggestions for kind of injecting skepticism into my students, because they're adults and they're already kind of stuck in their ways. I have students who, honest to God, believe in mermaids. And how do you, I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on how to suggest that maybe witches are not real.
Well, welcome to the Skeptrack.
Yeah.
This is what we're fighting against. So, who wants to take this one?
Well, yeah, I would start by saying that it is usually easier for people to see flaws in other people's reasoning than their own. So if you can identify a belief system or some kind of belief that you think is probably going to be universally understood as not valid, and then talk about the process by which it came to be understood as not valid, right? So one of the examples I use a lot when I'm talking to college groups is, this is why you can't major in alchemy at college, right? Even though that used to be considered cutting edge science and many people were working on it, enough research was done to see that it wasn't going to work the way people thought, that lead was not going to turn into gold, and we can take that off the list of our things, right? And so if you choose something like that is commonly agreed upon as not being correct, and then start to turn the mirrors at, like, can you think of any of your beliefs that might be, you know, in the process of being disputed, you know, anything like that. But I think it helps to find a common thing that people can agree on as, and see as used to have been considered valid and no longer considered valid. Like the earth going, or the sun going around the earth, that's another one. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we've just learned enough about to be able to dismiss and say, nope, that's not how it works. And then to talk about the ones that might currently be in that process of being disavowed.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, I was just going to give us about 30 seconds for
I was going to
final
say,
thoughts.
my approach would be to call them on the evidence. Do they have magazine articles about mermaids that that confirm that they're real?
Oh, we're
Can you
not up
question
to
that-
like Photoshop is wrong yet.
Yeah, can
like-
you engage in a dialogue about, well, this is just an imaginary thing that people do for fun?
Okay. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm so sorry we've reached the end of our time here, but we do have a table set up out front for meet and greet out in front of the glass area. Ken doesn't want me to call it a spitting area, but I just but nobody knows that the escalators used to be there because they've remodeled. Anyway, I hope our panelists would be able to join folks out there and answer questions. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your coming, and remember, stay safe, stay skeptical, and do no harm. Bye-bye, y'all.